Okay, so let's just see. You can hear me? Perfect. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for giving me such an astonishingly warm Somervillian welcome. As Neelam, thank you, and congratulations for your election. But as Neelam said, I did end up applying to Christchurch, in part because there was no tutor for biochemistry at the time here at Somerville, although Mum put up a very good case. But that was where it ended up. So, Jan, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for putting on this astonishingly room packed of people for today's talk. And I wanted to just rehearse a little bit what we did with the Vaccine Task Force. And what I'm going to do is rattle through very quickly, just hitting the headlines of what we did, and then basically try and leave as much time as possible for questions, which I hope I'll be able to answer. And Mum, thank you for bringing me here, and thank you for being a Somervillian. So. Okay, so May the 6th was when I was first called to be the first chair of this new vaccine task force. But in fact, it wasn't the first thing I'd been pulled in to do. So Patrick Vallance is actually the reason why I'm standing here. So he and I knew each other very well from when he was running R&D at GSK. And right from the beginning, Patrick recognised that the government's approach to vaccines was not all it could be. So he kept pushing and pushing and saying, you know, what are we doing about vaccines? And the answer kept coming back, don't worry, we're on it. And after a few times being told, don't worry, we're on it, he then said, okay, tell me what you're on. And the answer was, we're going to try and procure vaccines just like we do with flu. And at that point, Patrick said, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to create what he then called was a vaccine task force. But what that was actually a group of officials within BASE, which is the business department, to be advised by an expert group of vaccine professionals. So that actually started mid-March. I ended up with an email on April Fool's Day inviting me to join this expert group, and to which my reaction was, well, I'm not a vaccine expert, Patrick. Why on earth are you asking me? And the answer was what he wanted was somebody with that expertise and knowledge of the small company landscape, because that's actually where the innovation comes from, even if it's ultimately the pharmaceutical companies that deliver and distribute. So I agreed to do it. It became very clear that 1 hour's advisory talk every other week actually wasn't doing anything at all. So after the second meeting, I emailed Patrick and said, look, you've got to make this a bit more permanent and do something with it with authority and power, because this is a talking shop that's not really working. And obviously Patrick had figured that out, was always one step ahead of me. And so during the third meeting I attended, I got a text from Matt Hancock. And I was actually trying to do 2 meetings at the same time because I had a clash with one of my portfolio companies. So I had 2 screens up, which is of course not how you're supposed to do meetings, but anyway, I did. And he texted me and said, can we speak? And I said, no, you're supposed to be joining this meeting anyway, and it's a government, vaccine meeting. So anyway, we spoke afterwards, and he said, would you chair the vaccine task force? We're going to create a dedicated body. To which I sort of virtually fell off the chair because I hadn't thought on earth why was he calling me. And I asked for 24 hours to think about it, because I gave him all the reasons why I couldn't do it. And then eventually he said to me, Kate, look, none of us have done this before. We're asking you to step up. And that was a little hard not to take that seriously. And when I questioned him on what authority was he inviting me, he said he'd just come back from the Prime Minister. So I asked for 24 hours. I am very lucky to be married to the most amazing husband, Jesse Norman, who then was Financial Secretary of the Treasury. So obviously he actually spent £1 billion doing furlough and all the self-employed funding. But he absolutely helped me navigate through government and Whitehall and Parliament and everything. And so the following day, we went back with Jesse's clear advice with a list of conditions saying I would do it, but only subject to these terms. So the terms were, it was reporting to the Prime Minister, it was a 6-month term, I could recruit who I wanted, and the government would put in place a very streamlined decision-making process. And then, because I was convinced that government always leaks everything, my final condition was that I got to sign off on all comms. But it didn't really make any difference, that one. But all the other ones did make a difference. So when Boris called me, he basically said, I want you to do 3 things. Oh, well, I'll go through the challenges at the time. So Boris called me. He said, I want you to do vaccines for the UK, sort out vaccines to make sure that vaccines, if any are successful, get fairly and equitably distributed around the world. And I want you to put in place plans so that we're better set up for next time. And so my reaction back to Boris, and why I was so cautious about whether or not I should even take on this role in the first place, was that this was a monumental uphill struggle. So no vaccine had ever been developed against any human coronavirus. So it wasn't, there was no likelihood that we'd even be successful in developing vaccines against such a virus, such as the common cold. I mean, these are things that we've not been successful in generating vaccines. We didn't know anything about COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19 disease. We knew nothing about it. We knew what it looked like, but we didn't really know much about its transmission, who it infected, what the consequences were, how to block it. And the other issue, which is the chart, for those of you with really good eyesight, basically the quickest time it had ever taken to develop a new vaccine in the past was 5 years. And that was mumps, and that was 50 years ago. So in terms of the likelihood of being able to develop a vaccine fast, it was very low. And of course, the most advanced vaccines were ones about which we knew the least. So I'll get into that a little bit. But this was a really uphill struggle. So for me, this was sort of a career-limiting step, because the likelihood was this would all fail, I would spend a lot of money, and then you'd have a lot of people saying, what on earth are you doing? You don't know anything about vaccines anyway. So that was the position I was in. Boris then gives me these 3 goals, which I think were very clear, and it is notable that there were only 2 governments in the world that actually took on this separate structure of putting in place basically a dedicated team to deal with vaccines, and that was the UK and the US. Now, I'm not making any comments about the political leadership of those 2 people, but it is very interesting that they're both mavericks that want to do it their own way. And in this case, I think they both got it right. So the first thing I did, of course, was to put the team in place. And in parallel with my being appointed, which again, Patrick had no idea about. So, I mean, it just tells you the pace that this was going. The civil service were also deciding who should be my Director General. So for those of you who haven't been in government, you need basically a senior civil servant who can make sure that everything you do is kosher and obeys all the rules and all of that. So Nick, I was told when I was appointed, and you know the good news is you've got Nick. So Nick is a former bomb disposal engineer, had a career in the army, then went into the private sector, and then had been seconded from the private sector into defence purchasing. And so it was known to the government, and then because of his skills, he was then pulled in to help deal with PPE. So it turns out he lived right next door to me in London. I came up from Wales. I met him and the Alok Sharma, the Minister of State then in business. And I met Nick, and I showed up in spandex on my bike. He showed up in his running gear, and it was very clear that we were going to get on like a house on fire. And I said, look, I will deal with all the industry, all the technical, all the commercial stuff that is relevant on vaccines, but you need to basically make sure that you sort out the government side of things. So I brought in experts that were going to evaluate the technical side of the vaccines, manufacturing, clinical development, and working with industry so that we could put in place that capability going forward. And Nick then put in place commercial procurement, project management, delivery, diplomacy, because obviously we're dealing internationally, and then a director to then help make sure that all our business cases and everything were kosher. So that's what we did. We had meetings on Zoom, or no, actually Teams, 8 o'clock, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 hours, incredibly efficient. I didn't meet most of the team until after I left, and it was highly effective. So we had none of the chit-chat, everyone just got on with it, highly empowered, and we knew what we were doing. And then the second part of one of my conditions was that we would have a speedy government decision-making process. So the government basically put in place this investment committee, which is just how I work in venture capital, where we have investment committees that will look at investment proposals, and we'll pick holes in them and say, we like this, we don't like this, or go back and sharpen your pencil on this. And this was our investment committee. So we had to basically produce business cases recommending purchasing of vaccines or investment in manufacturing or clinical development, whatever it might be. And this was the committee which would then make the decision. And I have to say that worked incredibly well. So we prepared those cases. We were able to hold meetings whenever we needed to. And if it was late on a Friday night, then it was late on a Friday night. But they were responsive, they read their stuff, and they approved, obviously, everything we said, which was good. But the process actually worked very well, which was we were the external advisors that were coming in with our expert advice as what to do. The civil service made sure that the actual documents and the business cases were written and prepared in the way that was suitable for government. And then the ministers, and they managed the sort of the low-level budget of running the teams and so on. And then the ministers, and only the ministers, committed the public spending. So I have to say that worked really well and was one of the key lessons that really needs to be brought forward in how our government, or governments in general, work, rather than doing things sequentially, which is what it normally takes. So this is just a very sort of crude schematic. We were dealing with, initially, I think it's about 190 different vaccines when I started in May 2020. And the most advanced vaccines, as I mentioned, were the ones about which we knew least. So the top left, sorry, the bottom right are the ones that were the most advanced. So they were the most advanced in the clinic in terms of we had vaccine candidates which were either preclinical or already in the clinic, but about which we knew nothing. So these vaccine formats had never been approved for any vaccine ever. So again, we're dealing with a highly risky position where the chances, again, that these vaccines would fall over was going to be very high. But they were the most advanced. So we then decided to balance our portfolio with what we thought were the most promising from those two most risky vaccine formats, so the adenoviral vaccines, such as Oxford and also Janssen, together with mRNA. So again, we prioritised the BioNTech-Pfizer vaccine over Moderna based on data and our belief that we could get it actually delivered to the UK quickly. And then, so we bookended it with the tried and tested vaccines, which are the protein-based vaccines and the whole viral-based vaccines. So those two are types of formats that we currently use in all our other vaccines. So they're tried and tested, and they're not the hairy, scary vaccines, which were the most advanced. So we built a portfolio of 7 vaccines across those 4 different vaccine formats, with the expectation that we would have the most promising vaccines within the portfolio, so that if any of them worked, then we would have at least one of them in the portfolio. And people would ask me, was I concerned that we hadn't picked the right one? And actually, the answer was I wasn't concerned that we hadn't picked the right one. I knew that if any one of these vaccines worked, we will have picked the best ones in that, because we had a real kick-ass team that did the work properly. But I didn't know if anyone would work. I mean, the much bigger concern was, might they all fail? And one of the things I'd persuaded the government to do, which they, again, were really ballsy to do, was they were willing to put money up front before we knew whether or not any of these vaccines would work. Because if we waited to figure out whether or not the vaccines were both safe and effective before we started scaling up and manufacturing, it would be another year before we got the vaccines. So we had to start investing in manufacturing scale up as soon as we decided we were going to prioritise those vaccines and support the clinical development. But if those vaccines failed, all that money would be wasted. So we ended up spending 900 million sterling in upfront spending, all of which could have been lost in order to buy what was, whatever this is, 357 million doses. Our expectation was that we asked JCVI, which is the vaccination group, how many vaccines we needed to buy, because that's not my call. I just need to make sure we bought enough. And they told us that their priorities were what turned out to be groups 1 through 9. So everybody over the age of 50, and then in all adults with severe underlying disease and healthcare workers. So those were our priority groups, and that works out at about 30 million people. So you will see in the units of vaccines that we were buying were done in units of 30 million people. So most of these vaccines were 2-dose vaccines. So we would buy 60 million vaccines and so on. So that's how it worked. We also put in place a term sheet to acquire neutralizing antibodies. So that's effectively an immune response in a syringe. for people who are immunocompromised, who can't mount an immune response themselves with a vaccine. And of course, those can also be used to treat patients whose own immune response isn't clearing the vaccine. So we did that, but that was one of, again, my disappointments. We didn't make a lot of progress with that. What we did do, though, on clinical development was absolutely supercharge what we were able to do in terms of clinical trials in the UK. So we may well get into the whole discussions about Europe and everything else, but the answer was we decided to work on our own. I voted Remain, so I didn't come into this with any political view at all about how to do it, but the Europeans basically just put too many conditions on it to make sense. And so we needed to make sure that if we wanted to get access to the best vaccines, we had to be a really good customer. So that meant we needed to be thoughtful, proactive, and supportive to the different vaccine companies. So they would want to work with us because they knew we'd be able to help them get their vaccines developed quickly. So one of our offers was to basically be able to run clinical trials very quickly in the UK. And when June starts, you will see that the regulatory environment was a complete game changer for us. And we wouldn't have been able to do anything without June and her team. And what we did was to create a vaccine registry on the NHS website so that anybody sitting at home could sign up to the website and say that they were willing to be contacted about clinical trials. And our goal was to be able to go to vaccine companies and say, we've got people already signed up, waiting to join a clinical trial, which explicitly includes those people most at risk from infection. So there's no point us having a registry of volunteers, all of whom were 25-year-olds and fit and healthy. We had to have people that were elder and people with underlying disease because the vaccines had to work in those cohorts if they were going to be effective. And amazingly, now we've got over 500,000 people that have signed up. And we had over a third of those people over the age of 60. So we absolutely got what we wanted, and we were able to get the trials set up and run incredibly quickly. So it was absolutely one of the real triumphs of the Vaccine Task Force. And with luck, that registry will now be expanded to go beyond recruitment of volunteers and now to being recruit patients, so that any patient with any diagnosis anywhere, if they're eligible to join a clinical trial, if they're not managed by their current medication, is something that could be used. So that was something that was great. We did human challenge, which I can get into. So that's how do you actually systematically test head-to-head in sort of challenge studies where you infect young, fit, healthy volunteers to see how the vaccines work. And we also we put in place really industrialized testing of antibodies so that of the vaccine, so we could absolutely make sure that we were comparing apples and apples and apples all the way through, because up early on in the whole pandemic, everybody was reporting different results, but they were all using completely different experimental techniques. So basically, it was very difficult to really compare them. And then what we did was to supercharge the manufacturing capability in the UK. So we didn't have time to, build new factories from scratch, and there was all sorts in the press about, we'd turned down the ability to, develop a greenfield site and stuff. And all that was bollocks. We had to basically take what was there and scale it up and make sure that we could boost it to the maximum possible capacity possible. And that's what we did. So we did buy a veterinary vaccine plant in Braintree, which we converted into and upgraded into human manufacturing capability. But what we needed was to have a manufacturing capability that was flexible, because again, we didn't know which of any of these vaccines would work. And so in modern day biological manufacturing, actually you can build those clean rooms and those capabilities. And so it doesn't matter whether you're manufacturing adeno or mRNA or protein or antibodies, you can do so in these flexible plants. So we took what was there, we bought equipment and massively scaled up from what had been sort of low level. I mean, just put it in numbers, the bulk of the maximum of most of the capability was about 200 litres, and we needed to get to 2,000 litres and beyond. So we were having to scale it up really dramatically. And because you're growing up live mammalian cells, this is not easy. And I had one run-in with Matt Hancock at one of the meetings, and he just said to me, I can't believe you've not more ambitious about the rate of scale-up. And I said, well, I think, the numbers we've got here are heroic, and I think we won't even get these at Christmas. And then he said to me, well, so many experts have told me things aren't possible. He basically said, I don't believe you. So I then called my manufacturing guru afterwards and said, I just want to absolutely be sure that I haven't stuck my neck out too far saying that, you know, the scale up that we can achieve is unrealistic. And he paused and he said, no. What you've said already is very optimistic. And I said, but is there anything we could be doing to scale up these vaccines even faster than we're doing? And he paused and he said, well, you could try singing to the cells and ask them to grow faster. But apart from that, no. So we did a pretty good job, actually. So we have 4 separate sites around the UK now that are scaled up to bigger bulk. I mean, it's not the scale of, you know, Serum Institute in India, but we now have much more substantial capability in the UK than we did before, and is flexible and trained and efficient. Even we send our teams out to continental European sites to help them scale up and manufacture. So that's why, you know, all the political arguments about who was doing what and taking whose vaccines was just bollocks. At the ground, this was an industry that was absolutely coming together. And interestingly, the industry had come together in February. So before there was a vaccine task force, before I was doing anything at all, the industry had come together and said, look, we need to scale up vaccines if they ever come, and we're going to be the ones who are asked to do it, so we might as well get going now and start doing it. So again, it's a very interesting lesson between the government's general suspicion of business always being out to pocket whatever money they can get hold of, versus actually good corporate behaviour, which is they know what they need to do and they're going to do it whether or not they've got a contract. They didn't get contracts for about 3 months. So then, and we'll get on to June's wonderful work, and I might just, if I can, no, I won't well, I will just preempt one little thing, but which we'll get in the way of your presentation. But basically, June did a completely phenomenal job at the MHRA because normally, 2 things that are the bottlenecks in getting any new drug or vaccine approved. One is actually getting people into the trials and recruiting and running the trials, evaluating it and moving on. And we were able to basically compress that. Once we did the safety testing, because we had money, we were able to massively compress the rest of the trials so that we could scale those up. But the second thing is the regulatory process about how do you do it. And the thing that June will talk a little bit more about is the ability that June led, which was this whole idea of a rolling review process, which is don't wait till you've got everything ready and then we'll review it once it's all, every I is dotted and every T is crossed. Anything, any data you've got, as you've got it, share it with us so that we can get up to speed, we can help, we can advise. And it was completely game-changing. And the reason why the UK was the first to approve the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is because of June and because of the way she led the regulatory body here in the UK in a way that has never been led in any regulatory body anywhere in the world. And that is a phenomenal achievement. And more importantly, Pfizer correctly said that they did not believe we had enough infection in the UK in 2020, in the summer of 2020, when they were running the trials. So they hadn't even run the trials in the UK. And yet the relationship between Pfizer and the MHRA was so close that we were still able to come out first. So it is a real tribute. And again, it goes back to the future of how we in the UK can continue to perform. So you won't be able to see many of these, but the punchline is these vaccines were hugely effective. We were able to have very, very substantial protection against infection and then even more substantial protection against severe disease and death. And when we first got that Pfizer data, it was completely game-changing because most flu vaccines only have about a 50% efficacy in terms of protection against infection. And in our darkest moments, we were wondering, you know, if we got a 30% protection against infection, if the vaccine was safe, you know, would the regulators approve it and would we be able to actually start using it? And my view was probably would, because 30% was still better than 0. And so when we got the Pfizer data that said it's over 90%, it just meant an enormous sigh of relief because it meant it was highly likely that we would get at least some levels of efficacy with these other vaccine formats, which then meant we would have a broad, diverse portfolio, not just for the UK, but then we could obviously ship any surplus vaccine that we had around the world. So that was fantastic. And then I just put this slide up, which again, you don't really need to see, but the punchline is that the vaccine that was the biggest in terms of volume produced in 2021 was made by AstraZeneca. So here is a pharmaceutical company that partnered with Oxford University after that trial had already started. They committed to selling the vaccine at non-profit, and they committed that they would work with the UK government to ensure that their vaccine was distributed around the world to everybody that needed it. And they've done so, and they manufactured more vaccine than China and more vaccine than Pfizer. And that is completely phenomenal from a standing start from a university that actually managed to now basically vaccinate the world. So again, the political shenanigans about what went on with that vaccine was deeply, deeply damaging and caused thousands of people to die that shouldn't have died. But it was a phenomenal outcome. And I'm pleased to say that I have just heard that AZ has just hired 2 senior people in vaccines. So I'm hoping that that's now going to turn into a much more robust, ongoing vaccine activity within AZ, which was a company which had not been in vaccines before. So this has been fantastic, and they did it at non-profit. I put in this chart just on inequality because I think one of the failures that we, the UK, and the Vaccine Task Force was unable to really deliver was to ensure that we did have, despite the wonderful successes of the AstraZeneca-Oxford vaccine, was we still have vast inequality of vaccine distribution. Now, clearly those are political decisions, and not very much we could really do about it other than to make sure that we had the supply and as well as work with all the countries around the world. So I had a lot of countries that called me both during my tenure and actually bizarrely just as much afterwards, asking, what do we do now? And I was sort of saying, well, it's, nothing to do with me. But so at an operating level, we were highly collaborative with other countries. But I think for next time, and we're not out of this yet, so we still have vast parts of the world that aren't properly vaccinated. Now, it may be that Omicron will do it all for us, but we do need to work out how globally we're going to do a better job. And then there are other things we need to do. We need to have better formats. So we can't be dealing with 2 doses of an injectable vaccine that requires a cold chain. It's just too expensive, and it's not practical for low-income countries. So we've got to find alternative ways, patches, pills, sprays, whatever it might be. We've got to be able to manufacture these much more easily so that it doesn't take such heroic efforts to scale them up. And we need a broader base of therapeutics and antibodies to actually treat patients. So in terms of sort of key things that I think worked, one of the main things was I just treated this as a venture capital investment, which is all I know. I mean, that's what I've done for the last 30 years. And what we do is invest in highly risky companies. So we have to balance risk with potential upside. We have to think about what are the critical things that we need to achieve, and then throw whatever needs to be thrown at it to bring that expertise to make it give it the maximum chance of success. So I think risk is a really important part, and that's not something that sits easily in government. I think our networks are very good because I pretty much knew, between me or Clive, we pretty much knew everybody we needed to in terms of being able to pick up the phone and speak to these vaccine companies. And the number of times I had people saying, we've been passed from pillar to post and pillar to post, and we'd given up with the UK. And then I call them and they say, oh, phew, we've got somebody we can talk to. So I think that network was massively helpful. We were very much took the approach of partners, not adversaries. So our view was that we were there to help them get their vaccine scaled up and proven to be safe and effective. We were not there to try and penny pinch or to chip away at price. As it was, we only paid a little over £10 a dose on average. So it's just not a lot of money, but it did matter. Every day we took was going to take more people into hospital and potentially to die. And I have to say, government did a great job. So my experience getting those decision-making was fantastic. I've certainly got comments about the level of scientific understanding in government, which I think is appalling. But actually, as we were set up, was incredibly effective. And the government was willing to accept the idea of losses. And that is something that I think, again, from a how do we translate this into ongoing peacetime, the idea of doing things and failing well and sensibly is very different from just everybody being castigated every time something goes wrong, and then there's a lot of, well, you didn't do this properly. So I think it worked really well, and I think that's it. Slide 15 and 15, I'm done. So I'm ready to take questions.